I would say that most people have a sort of a superficial understanding, which is something like this. They think, oh, very occasionally people are born in the wrong body, or they have some medical or psychological condition that makes them deeply, deeply distressed at being the sex they are. Doctors are able to diagnose that. They can offer a treatment which is pretty good. They know who to choose. They give that person that treatment. And then all that is left for the rest of us to do is to accept those people. And that was kind of the paradigm 50, 60, 70 years ago, except that the treatments weren't ever anything as good as people think they are. Like, it was called sex change, but you can't actually change people's sex. All you can do is do a very rough approximation that's not very functional. But now it doesn't mean that anymore to the activists. What it means to the activists is that all of us are men, women, male, female, boy, girl, according to some sort of innate feeling or identity. And that's something we're born with. It's not something that's necessarily related to our bodies. And only we can say whether we really are a boy or a girl. So you're meant not to know that I'm a woman until I tell you so. And then what that means is it's a theory about absolutely everybody. It means that you teach children that biological sex is some version of not real, or at least not important. You tell them that they'll know whether they're a boy or a girl, and how you're meant to know that, given that you only have access to your own experiences, is never made clear. But what quickly happens is people start pointing to stereotypes of behaviour and preferences for clothes and such like, and say that people who are girly are therefore girls, even if actually they're physically boys. And then they tell us that, this is the most important thing about you, and that somehow you have to align your body to this gender identity. And that last bit's not very clear, because if your gender identity isn't the same as your sex, then why would you need to align it? So it's all quite confusing, and it's quite fast changing and not very easy to comprehend. And a part of the problem is that if you try and ask any questions about it, the questions themselves are meant to be bigoted. You're meant to just accept what people tell you. So I don't blame anybody for finding this confusing. I almost think you're meant to find it confusing. You're not meant to be thinking or asking questions. You're meant to be just accepting and going along with it. Yeah, I mean, I'd start with that, there have always been kids with deep-seated issues thing. That's kind of true and kind of not true at the same time. It is always true that distress is always with us, mental distress is always with us, but the form that it takes very much depends on the culture that you're in, the stories that culture tells to itself about what distress means. There are ailments, historical ailments like hysteria or vicarious menstruation, that we just don't see anymore because they're not stories we tell to each other anymore. And PTSD is a relatively recent sort of almost invention. The distress was experienced differently at different times. Every now and then it's true, a child or an adult might sort of settle on the idea that they were in the wrong body or they were meant to be the opposite sex as their way of expressing their distress. But it's very rare that these ideas pop up unseeded by a culture. So something happened over the last century or so, really gaining pace in the last decade, that large numbers of people both felt a distress that could be interpreted as being born in the wrong body and decided that that's how they would interpret that distress. So it didn't really happen very often 50 years ago. It almost never happened in children. And when it did, it was almost exclusively very effeminate little boys. I mean, some boys are born very, I hate the word effeminate, but we all know what I mean. And those boys are much, much more likely than other boys to grow up gay. And every homophobe knows that. Every dad who wants to toughen up his son because he doesn't want a gay son knows that. And those boys, those sweet little boys who are just doing what comes naturally to them, are very prone to getting bullied, shamed, told that they must act differently. And that can create this gender distress, because at some point that boy thinks to himself, everything would be much easier if I was a girl. I was meant to be a girl. I must be a girl stuck in a boy's body. So that was the only cases among children that clinicians really ever saw. And they certainly never thought of doing anything physical for that boy or telling him that he really was a girl. And then that changed over the last 20 years, really since, in the 1990s, some Dutch clinicians started thinking about treating those boys as if they were really girls. I'm sure we'll get to the story of puberty blockers in a bit. And it got picked up in America just short of 20 years ago. And then it started to be given without any safeguards to quite a large number of people. And then in the 2010s, teenage girls started to turn up at the clinic. And they just hadn't been seen by gender clinicians before. There literally wasn't a single academic paper on gender distress in teenage girls before about 2010. Not one.
Not one.
So the clinics are now seeing these girls, and they're giving them a treatment pathway that was created for effeminate little boys, who, by the way, should never have been treated anyway in that way. But it was just being given to them. So something happened in the culture is the short answer to why we're seeing it now. And we can maybe unpick bits of that, like what's happening in schools, online, with pornography and so on. But yeah, there's a lot of elements to it.